overly aggressive imperialistic U.S. naval warships antagonize peaceful, friendly China by sailing through the Straits of Taiwan, and the prospect of World War III becomes much, much, much more remote. Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Stephen Green and Scott Ott, and this is your right angle on the U.S. Navy finally having a commander-in-chief who knows what a Navy is for. Not too long ago, two American warships, U.S.S. Ticonderoga, which is a CG-52, it's a guided missile cruiser, and U.S.S. Wilbur, which is a DDG, it's a DDG-52, by happy coincidence, it's a guided missile destroyer. Two American warships sailed through the Strait of Taiwan. And this was considered an extremely provocative act on the part of the Chinese government, because the Chinese government maintains that the island of Taiwan belongs to China, to the People's Republic of China, and that it's their territory, and, quote, that they reserve the right to be able to recapture it by force at any time they choose. So if you have to recapture it by force, I'm not entirely sure it's your territory, but we'll leave that aside for a second. China has been growing a navy, and I think we should start this by a fundamental understanding between the two countries involved here. China is an agricultural nation that is land-based and therefore is essentially dependent on its army, and it's primarily based on agriculture. The United States, on the other hand, is a trading nation who is primarily maritime in focus, and rather than a standing internal army, we have a navy because we're outward looking, China's inward looking. That's the way that we have to understand the basics of this entire arrangement. But China's developing a navy, and they're trying to develop a navy that's going to challenge the U.S. Navy. And what China has been doing has been claiming areas of international waters as their own. The definition of international waters here is interesting, fellas. It used to be referred to as the high seas, generally considered that a 12 nautical miles, slightly longer than statute miles, 12 nautical miles from the shore is the waters of that country. So if you get 12 miles or inside a beach outside of China, you're in China's waters. But outside of 12 miles, those are international waters, and you have freedom to navigate. Just to set the stage here, because I know most people never really understood this, there's also something called an exclusive economic zone, which goes out to 200 miles, and certainly the parts of the Straits of Taiwan are within China's exclusive economic zone, but that's not international waters. That means China has a right to develop those waters, but it doesn't mean they have a right to stop the free passage of trade and shipping. If it's outside of 12 miles, you're in international waters. That's where the American vessels clearly were. So the reason I say this is about to prevent a war, I think, is a pretty important observation. Steve, we'll start with you.
Sure.
China is essentially saying, by dredging up the bottom of the ocean and creating new islands there and extending not only maybe a 12-mile radius, but a 200-mile radius from these artificial islands that are essentially immobile aircraft carriers that they've created, they're essentially trying to say the entire South China Sea is ours. There is no international waters. The South China Sea is ours, and it's much like us. Turns out the Taiwan Strait's about 100 miles wide. The Straits of Florida are 90 miles wide. There's 90 miles between Cuba and the United States. And that's like us saying we're going to dredge up a couple of islands between here and Cuba, and therefore the entire Gulf of Mexico is ours. You don't get to sail into the Gulf of Mexico. You don't get to cruise into the Gulf of Mexico unless we say that you can. So this seems a little unfair to me.
Yeah, it would be completely illegal. This might seem a little dry. I'm a big Navy partisan, and I have been probably since I was in high school, because navies take a long time to build. The traditions take even longer to establish, and you can lose them like that if you aren't careful, or in our case, just let our Navy atrophy like we have since the big riff of the early 90s. That said, I've been reading a really interesting book on the Central Pacific Campaign from 1944 to 45 called The Fleet at Flood Tide. And there's a great thing in that. I talked about part of this in the backstage, which is only available to members. But there's another part of it that's really fascinating, because it goes to the heart of why you have a Navy. During the invasion of Saipan, Admiral Spruance with Task Force 58 had all of these carriers, battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers. I mean, he had just one of the most powerful fleets ever assembled to support the invasion of Saipan. And it was close enough to the home islands of Japan that Japan was going to contest this invasion. They had to, because we were going to build B-29 bomber bases on that island that could bomb Japan. And Spruance's other admirals were saying, hey, listen, we've got all these aircraft carriers. We got to go after the Japanese fleet in this sort of glory decisive battle, right? Well, Spruance realized his job wasn't to sink the Japanese fleet. I mean, it would be great if he did, but his real job was to protect the troop transports, because you
Precisely correct.
you have to take the island to build the airfields, to take the war to the Japanese home islands. So he didn't send his fleet out in pursuit of the Japanese, and he didn't exactly know where they were, so it might have been fruitless. He kept his firepower concentrated. He let the Japanese come to them, and that's another story. But the heart of the issue is, in wartime, you have to protect the transports. Now, in peacetime, we're a maritime trading nation, as you said. We have to be able to protect the container ships that carry our oil, that carry our trade goods, that carry all the things that make us and that we make us a wealthy nation. We rely on trade for that. So you have to protect the transports, and we have been letting our transport fleet atrophy even worse than our fighting navy. And so we could find ourselves in a place where we just can't move the troops around in wartime, and we can't protect the trade ships either. We're about to be in a very precarious position over the next 10 years unless we get serious about this. Now, China seems to understand what the Japanese understood, in that they've got these island bases, but the South China Sea doesn't really matter, Bill. And let me tell you why. China's imports, that their trade, that their wealth rely on, come from the Indian Ocean. The South China Sea is a sideshow. What we need is to maintain and increase our capacity to take the fight, not to the South China Sea, but to the Indian Ocean, where so far the Chinese can't reach. Outside of their domestic air cover, their continental air cover, and that's where we fight them, not close to their shores, but where their trade ships go in the Indian Ocean. The South China Sea, sideshow. But if we don't maintain our fleet, if we don't increase our fleet, we're going to be spread too thin, and they're going to win by default.
Well, Scotty, and that was great, Steve.
I'm sorry I went on so long.
The issue, no, it was great. It was really terrific. The issue is Taiwan. The reason that the Chinese are doing what they're doing and building up a blue water navy, deep water navy, and everything is because of Taiwan. And they've said they want Taiwan back, and China is building a military that will eventually, in the minds of the Chinese communists, be capable of recapturing Taiwan, which to them is a thorn in their side, much the same way as having nuclear missiles in Cuba was for us. Except we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. Otherwise, it'd be a similar situation. Now, Taiwan is an independent, free country made up of the remnants of the Chinese Republican forces after the communists won the battle on the mainland. The Chinese non-communists basically went to Taiwan, and it's been an independent country ever since. But China wants it back. So what do you say to people when they say it's none of our business? We're provoking them in their own backyard, and we're bringing ourselves closer to a third world war by strutting around and waving, and rattling our sabers when we don't have any business being there.
I think this is one of the situations, like so many others, where you have to have faith in some fundamental principles. You have to have faith in the idea that tyranny and dictatorship and controlled economies ultimately will collapse, that they can't go on forever. I think China had that realization some decades ago when they began to open up and allow more so-called free enterprise and establish little zones where you could have free enterprise. And now China has become so deeply entwined with, if nobody else, the United States at the very least, as a hub for manufacturing products that are developed in the United States. China has become heavily reliant upon U.S. markets, the purchases that we make as consumers here in this country, that they can't just go off on a jag and say, hey, we're going to start shooting at ships, because they are so interwoven with us. They own a huge amount of our debt as well. And so there is a somewhat of a symbiotic relationship here that can only tend in one direction, and that is that China needs to move further toward freedom. Taiwan has already moved further toward freedom, and I think that's what so offends the communist Chinese, is that they've seen that people of their own flesh and blood are over there living essentially the American dream, and they're by all accounts Chinese, and yet somehow there's a difference, there's a divide there, and it's not water. And so I think it's a fascinating situation, and China has managed to nibble their way to this point because they're afraid to take any bold strokes. So they'll build a little island with a little air base on it, and then they'll make an announcement saying that they're going to try to defend their rights in what they consider to be international waters. And then they had a close encounter with one of our ships recently where they try to kind of give a brushback pitch to us, but they can't afford to really set off the so-called World War III. It's not in their interest. And under the surface of the so-called 6 or 7% annual GDP growth that China has been reporting for years, what they're not reporting is how they've divided up their national debt among their states and their cities. So they have something like $6 trillion worth of debt that is off book, so to speak. But it's there. They're responsible for it. They have to take care of it. So all of that to say, China may hate us and they may wish to be the big dog in the camp here, but they can't afford to provoke the real big dog. They need us.
Yeah, this is the business about the money that's owed to China is always looked at as a major disadvantage for the U.S. and it is. But it reminds me of that tremendous adage, if you owe the bank $1,000, you got a problem. But if you owe the bank $1 million, they got a problem.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's the way that goes. Listen, this kind of bullying and this kind of, Scott got it exactly right, nibbling away at the margins, not just nibbling away at the margins of the territory, they're nibbling away at, once again, the one thing, this is the curse of the age, is they are nibbling away at the international law that has been established for the longest time. There's no question about all this other stuff. There's no question those American vessels were in international waters, and they are trying to say that law doesn't apply to them. And I say it does. And so we're going to have to find out whether it does or doesn't. And this is a giant game of chicken. Scott mentioned that there was a close call not too long ago. One of the American warships in the Taiwan Strait was intercepted by a Chinese ship and damn near rammed by them. They got within 40 yards, which is awful close. And I don't know if we turned away or so-called blinked. I bet we did, and I think it was appropriate to, because we're not prepared for this kind of lunacy. But when we send these two vessels back into the Straits of Taiwan, now we're talking about this. When I heard China was building these islands and declaring this territory of theirs, I said, this is exactly the time to send 4 carrier strike groups right between every one of those islands and say, well, we say no. If you allow bullies to continue unmolested, they become more and more confident. When they become overconfident, then bad things happen. That's why this was a step to prevent war. As far as the argument about it being their backyard goes, that's the argument that the British liberals made concerning Hitler in Czechoslovakia and Hitler in Austria and Hitler in the Sudetenland and all the rest. It's their backyard, none of our business. The fact that they're overrunning international law and subjugating people and launching wars of aggression, it's not who are we to say? It's Hitler's backyard, it's not our problem. When the law is being trampled and people are being deprived of their freedom, it's automatically our problem. And I guess the thing I would finally say about this whole thing is whether or not Taiwan is going to be worth it for the Chinese. We have come over the last 15 or 20 years to look at, many Americans look at China as the future, and that America's a fading power and that China's the future and that they've got all this money and they're building all this stuff. I talked to the admiral in San Diego who owns every surface ship in the Pacific, and he says they're building 6 destroyers for every one of ours. And I said, I don't like that.
Yeah.
But when we think of the Chinese and think of their growing, we do not ever understand the power that we have as a country, our military might of the United States. For China to conquer Taiwan means that China is not going to have to get rockets or airplanes or missiles. Steve nailed it. He's exactly right. For Taiwan to fall to mainland China, China is going to have to move large numbers of physical troops across the water 100 miles. And China has been developing a navy, but the United States Navy could stop that particular amphibious operation anytime we chose to. So we have to continue, for the safety of the Taiwanese and their freedom, we have to continue to make it clear to China that this is not going to happen. And if you want to go to war over China, well, then we will. Once they understand that we're not joking around, then all of a sudden things get peaceful. And I will just say one more thing, and I just wanted to take this story mostly so I could include this. It's been the high honor and privilege of my life to be on board the U.S.S. Pasadena, which is a nuclear-powered attack sub. And I was also on board the U.S.S. Spruance, which is an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, which is the main surface vessel that we're going to be seeing in these kind of situations for the foreseeable future. When we talk about them building 6 destroyers to every one of ours, and we look at how daunting that seems to be, we have to remember one thing, and that is that wars are not won by weapons. Wars are won by personnel. They're won by soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen and Coast Guardsmen. The Chinese visited the Spruance, and a couple of them wandered off by accident into some secure areas, as known to happen. But the one thing I think is most illuminating about this difference between us and China is what the executive officer on board the Spruance told me. He said, we toured their destroyers, they toured our destroyers. And the one thing that was fundamentally different was damage control. In the United States Navy, having had World War II experiences and some pretty nasty conflicts out there with the Japanese, American policy is now that every single sailor is a damage control officer, every one of them. Every single sailor is capable of putting out fires. Every single sailor is capable of donning the gas masks and doing it, because what we found at war, at sea, was that you would have a damage control party over here, and there'd be a fire and explosion here, and the stuff you need to get to is over here, and you can't get your damage control team to the scene of the fire. They said the Chinese can't process that. They can't process it. They are so culturally stratified that they cannot imagine the idea of taking common individual soldiers, or sailors in this case, and training them up. That's important. But the most important thing in terms of thinking about a naval conflict with China, is not the number of surface vessels, and it's not proximity to bases. It all comes down to one thing, and that is operational tempo. And I hate to bore you folks with this, but it's a good thing to know, because it'll helps me sleep easier and may help you sleep easier. Operational tempo means how quickly can we perform operations. They make a move, we make a move. Who can move the fastest? John Boyd picked this up. The person who's going to win this battle is not the person who makes the right decisions necessarily, but the one who's making the fastest decisions. China, there's tremendous inter-service rivalry in America, but that lives exclusively pretty much inside the Pentagon. The generals in the Pentagon and the admirals are always, we can't let the Navy have a better airplane than we do. That's fine. These are politicians in uniform. But our ability to coordinate Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard is unparalleled. It's the lesson we learned from Vietnam, and it was taught to us in very hard experience with Desert One when we tried to rescue the Iranian hostages, and we couldn't even pull out a desert rendezvous. Our operational tempo is extraordinarily high because we have a great deal of experience running a Navy. We have a great deal of experience coordinating our Navy with Air Force and ground units. The Chinese have little empires. The People's Republic Army is an empire, and the Navy is an empire. They don't talk to each other. They have no communication with each other. And so I simply say this: we need to sail American warships at 12.1 miles off the coast of China for as long as it takes for the Chinese to realize that they do not own the oceans. We don't prevent Chinese frigates from entering the Gulf of Mexico because we don't have the right to do that. And when the Chinese understand that there's somebody out there ready to enforce the law, then they will start rethinking this whole Taiwan thing. And this is how provocative incidents like this keep us safe.
Damn right.
It's pretty simple. It's historically proven to the beginning of time. Progressives will never understand it because the fundamental requirement for being a progressive is physical cowardice. This is what I've come to believe over the course of the last 10 years of my doing this work. That'll do it for this extended analysis of the China situation, brought to you by the paying members of BillWhittle.com, who allow me and Steve and Scott to make outrageous statements anytime we want to without fear of being fired, because we work for the people. And there's thousands of them, and we'd like to have you be one of them too. So you can go to BillWhittle.com and join up and be part of the team. Meanwhile, go Navy. And I will close with this reminder that I've been hard on millennials, and I've been hard on them quite a bit. But when I was on board the U.S.S. Spruance, I met a damage control officer, a female lieutenant who was probably 24 years old. She didn't weigh 90 pounds soaking wet. And after I was finished speaking with this young officer, I realized that this ship is in extraordinarily capable, dedicated, courageous hands, and this is not something that grows on trees. This is part of tradition, as Steve said. And the U.S. Navy is a match for anybody and is going to be for the foreseeable future. And I think we need to make that very, very clear. Thanks again for joining us on Right Angle. We'll see you next week.